This is APYouthNet.
Hello and welcome back to APYouthNet Talkshow, where we look at some of the key issues relating to youth employment in Asia and the Pacific. I'm Sophie Fisher from the International Labour Organization. In today's programme, we'll be looking at the issue of young people and trade unions. We'll be talking about the challenges and opportunities facing trade unions when they try and organise young workers. We'll hear from some very active young labour groups. And we'll talk about some of the strategies being put forward by trade unions to tackle the jobs crisis facing young people. Joining me in the studio today are Matthieu Cognac, the ILO's Youth Employment Specialist for Asia Pacific, and Christine Nathan, the ILO's Workers' Organisation Specialist for Asia and the Pacific. Welcome to you both. And on Skype from Australia, we have with us Josh Peake, City Organiser at the Shop, Distributive and Allied Employees Association of South Australia and the Northern Territory. Josh, a welcome to you too.
Great to be here.
Josh, let me start with you since you are the youngest person on this panel. Trade unions around the world are reporting declines in their membership. It also seems that young workers are not joining unions in the same way that previous generations did. Is this also a phenomenon that you're meeting in Australia?
Well, look, I think most certainly unions organising young workers is a difficult thing. I think we shouldn't kid ourselves about the difficulties that unions face in organising areas of employment that probably have never really been organised. And on top of that, the economy is changing. So we have a development of workers in services sectors that traditionally haven't been organised. And particularly within Australia, sure, there has been a big change within our economy as well. But I think all of that is just simply a challenge which unions, I think, are more prepared than ever to face. But I think it is a real challenge, particularly with a mobile labour market as well. Particularly in Australia, there used to be sort of it was quite common that people would have a job for life, that you'd enter the labour market in a particular workplace and stay there for your entire career. Where certainly now that's not the case. Some people may only be in jobs for 1, 2 or 3 years. And so that means that there's a whole bunch of new challenges that unions face in trying to ensure that we keep workplaces organised.
Matthieu, let me put the same question to you in a slightly different way. Why do you think that young people in Asia Pacific are not joining unions?
Well, first of all, we are in a situation of crisis. We have 75 million young people unemployed throughout the world. 45% come from Asia and the Pacific, and systematically they are 2 to 3 times more likely to be unemployed than adults. What we realize in this region, as well as in some others, is that systematically the young people will not have the same rights at work as their adult colleagues or counterparts. And they need to have a better access and understanding of what these rights are all about. And in that sense, them joining unions is something that they favor very much. There is no question about the willingness or the interest that young people would have to join unions. I think the question is a little bit more reversed. It's about how can the unions, particularly as Josh was saying, in a time of change from agriculture to industry to service, how can the trade unions reach out to these young people in an easier way? How can they make better use of the technology that is available? And how can they promote all of these services that are for many of them intangible services to the young people? It is not necessarily an easy thing for a young person to adhere to a union on the basis that it will be for intangible services. There is also the whole aspect about information, and there is a perception by many that a lot of the information, for example, like I was saying on the right side of work, is something that can be now found independently by Googling or by going on other places on the internet. And so the question is raised, do I really need to have a union to inform me of what these rights are all about? I think we know that the answer is that yes, there are many advantages and many reasons why the unions need to reach out to the young people, but it's in this reaching out that the effort needs still to be consolidated.
Okay, Christine, let me just get you to answer one specific question. Is this a phenomena of developed economies like Josh's, or does it also afflict developing economies?
Yes, in the developing countries, it's also a problem.
because most of the jobs created in the developing countries we can see are not full-time jobs. The jobs which are being created are largely in the informal economy. And as Josh from Australia said, that this group of workers are also very mobile, from part-time to casual to almost there's no full-time employment. Now, if you look at why they are not joining unions, yes, it has been, as Matthieu has said, they do not know about their rights and their responsibilities. But I would like to say here that these issues or this information you really don't get from internet or the website or from Google, because they really need to go to the national centers in their countries and talk to the trade unionists as to what are the reasons that how they should get organized, what are the methods for organizing, because they have absolutely no knowledge. And here it's more important, they feel at this point in time, rather have a job than even talk about union membership, because there has been cases in many of these areas that there has been an environment where the minute you talk about trade unions, there could be a possibility that this part-time or casual worker can lose his job, because the environment has to be conducive also for the young workers to know their rights, to know their responsibilities. And I think at this point in time, I would really like to say that there are organizations like the national federations or the global unions or the ITUC, which has now started bringing in youth committees to look at succession planning to take over the unions at the later stage. And there has been youth-to-youth organizing campaigns. There has been youth committees, there's been youth structures, there's been separate budgets for the youth set aside. So there are instances in many of these organizations where they're looking at youth getting into the formal structures of trade unions.
Josh, is what we have here a sort of chicken and egg situation whereby young people don't understand that their rights at work are an issue and therefore don't join unions, and because they're not in unions, they don't appreciate that they have rights at work?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, particularly within Australia, we have a big problem around secure employment. About 45% of our workforce are in insecure casual employment. And for many of these people, the issue that they're thinking about isn't necessarily about which union I should join. It's how do I ensure that I have hours next week and an ongoing income, and they're going to do everything that they possibly can to ensure that they're not going to aggravate their employer so they lose hours. And that's, I think, more of a challenge for trade unions than for anyone else. It's up to us to reach out to these people and say, we can assist you. You do have rights around guaranteed hours and about secure employment. And the Australian Council of Trade Unions this year launched a very big campaign around secure work and a better future. And I think it's these sorts of campaigns that talk about the challenges that young people are facing. I think that's a significant thing that whether it's particular unions or federations of labour need to be doing. It's about making sure that the campaigns that we're running are relevant to young people, and so that people can actually see that joining a union is something that is worthwhile and is going to benefit them.
So there's something that unions need to do here. They need to change their methods of communication, the way they're getting their messages out to young people, and perhaps change some of those messages too?
Well, I think there's a whole range of things that we need to be doing, but it's not that we need to be doing them. We already are doing them. So whether that's engaging with people via social media, whether that's working out different ways of contacting workers if they don't feel comfortable talking to unions at their worksite, or the worksite makes it difficult for them to talk to their unions, catching up out of hours or at different locations, ensuring that we're communicating with material that is easy to understand and talks the language of young people. The variety of things that we should be doing and that we are doing is incredibly broad. But I think it all comes down to making sure that we are understanding the issues of young workers and that we're seen to be communicating and responding directly to those issues.
Christine, I want to raise with you another point that Josh made, which was about the changing nature of work. Now, in the heyday of unions, they were centred around factories, about big centres of employment. Workers are now more spread out, and as you said, there's many more workers in the informal economy. This must be a huge challenge for union organisers.
Do we really call them a worker when they are in the informal economy? How do we address that? Because very often there are disguised form of employment relationships.
Such as?
You say they are self-employed, but they are not really self-employed. They're actually producing for someone. So for us,
subcontract
for the contractors. So actually, if you look at the employment relationship, which was discussed in 2002, that really said we have to establish who is the worker and who is the contractor. And today we call them self-employed workers, but they're really not self-employed. They are producing for someone. And this is some of the differences and the challenges which we have to establish as organizers, establish the contractor, establish the worker, and establish this employment relationship.
And just to clarify one technical point, there are 2 ILO fundamental conventions that cover freedom of association, the protection of rights to organise and collective bargaining. And they are Convention 98 on the right to organise and collective bargaining and Convention 87 on freedom of association and the protection of rights to organise. Now, workers are covered by those whether or not they are in unions and whether or not they're formal or informal sector. Is that correct?
I'm glad that you raised this very, very important question, Sophie, because this is one of the main fights which we are having in our region. First of all, the ratification level on these core conventions is very low in Asia Pacific. 87, 98 is highly important, even if you are looking at rights of young workers at the workplace. Now, the minute you say 87, there are many countries in our region which has not ratified 87, 98. And when we don't ratify 87, we don't have the right to organize. Most of the countries, and they do not let you organize workers in the informal economy. And that is where our workers are, and especially the young workers.
So just to clarify that point, countries that have not ratified Convention 87, unions are not allowed to organize in the informal sector?
There is a barrier there, because the minute we say we're organizing agricultural workers or construction workers in the informal economy, like domestic workers, we are really not allowed to organize. There are big walls put up there.
Now, despite the obstacles to unionising among young workers, there are a number of young active labour groups in this region. And let's hear now from 2 of these groups. The first is Public Services International, or PSI, Youth Network for Asia and the Pacific.
Hi, this is Tan Siwei from the Asia Pacific Youth Network of Public Services International, PSI. I'm also a young workers representative for the executive board for Asia Pacific region. I want to say that young workers need the trade union, and the trade union need the young workers. And if we fail to incorporate young workers into the trade union, then the trade union will be missing out on many new ideas and perspectives that young workers can contribute. The trade union needs to change and implement policies that can involve more young workers and also to mainstream young workers. I believe that our network will grow and we will be able to bring new solutions and ideas to the trade union for the coming challenges that the trade union will face.
Thank you, Tanziwe in Singapore. Now let's hear from an equally active young persons labour group in the Pacific.
Bula from the Fiji Islands. My name is Shantel Hazelman and I am a labour rights advocate with Young Labour Fiji. Our aim is to create awareness on labour rights, acceptable work conditions and education on current laws on employment relations. Young Labour are coordinating a range of activities such as workshop, training sessions with workers and students, and having clinics, help desks set up to respond to queries and issues workers face at their workplace, irrespective of them being a union member or not. Furthermore, Young Labour are also organizing separate sessions with trade unionists and legal practitioners to answer to workers' queries in regards to the laws at their workplace. We are also promoting awareness on leadership, developing in having community speeches, and encouraging debates on policy issues in Fiji. Also advocating on various and diverse issues surrounding our current employment relations. We, as Young Labour advocates, look forward to building with the ILO Youth Network in the Pacific. Vinaka.
Tanziwe and Shantel Hazelman, thank you very much for your contributions. Matthieu, both those young ladies mentioned the importance of education and awareness raising among young people about their rights to work. Bearing in mind so few young people are in unions, how do we start with that? They're not in unions, so they're not hearing the messages. They're not hearing messages, so they don't see the need to be in the unions. How do we break this vicious circle? What's the best strategy?
Yes, thank you. Well, one of the ways is, for example, to advocacy work at the ILO, doing a lot of trainings and workshops and conferences that deal with exposing the young people with their rights at work. We actually have a manual called Youth Rights at Work that is being adapted and translated into different languages and for many countries that serves those young people have access to a better knowledge of what their rights are.
Christine, would you agree, or do you feel there's too much of a problem of young people just thinking, I'm young people are exploited, that's the way it is?
It's the female who really don't go to schools or are pulled out at the time of crisis in the family. And this is where also we have to look at social protection for families. Because when families have a crisis on economic crisis or job crisis, the first thing is they do is pull the children out of school.
Or the girl out of the workforce
and the girl
to go
out,
home.
Exactly. So, or it's the first thing would be the girl is out of school. So I think we have to really combine this with social protection also to cover the young worker.
And things like social protection are exactly the sort of things that young people tend not to think about when they're looking for their first job.
That's right, and it's absolutely essential. And like Christine was saying, it's very important to actually work for these young girls before they make those choices of life that are irreversible, basically being married, having children, and so on. It's also important to remember that in terms of youth employment, one of the key causes that we have all observed is that young people are not included in the policy discussions. They are not included when we are about to put together a youth employment action plan or a youth employment strategy. It's very important to include them and to hear their voice. This has actually been heard very strongly at the recent Youth Employment Forum in Geneva and also at the International Labour Conference. Now, hearing the voice of the young people is a subject of debate, and we are all thinking together about how that voice can be heard even louder. And obviously, hearing it through unions is an essential way. It's important to say that the young people are 2 to 3 times more likely to be unemployed, but at the same time, in terms of the union density for young people, it is half than what it is for the adults. In other words, young people's voices are not heard in the ways that they could be heard.
We've been hearing about the difficulties of young people, particularly in the informal sector, and the difficulties they have in establishing their labour rights and joining unions. Now, it's important to understand that this isn't just a problem of Asia Pacific, it's a global problem. And it isn't just a problem of developing countries, you also find it very much in developed economies. So let's hear now from Emmanuel in France, who is seeing similar challenges for his friends and colleagues, young workers in Europe.
Donc Emmanuel Zemmour, je suis président de l'UNEF, l'Union nationale des étudiants de France, qui est le syndicat étudiant.
My name is Emmanuel Zemmour. I am the president of the National Union of French Students. I would like to come back to an issue which I find particularly important, the role of trade unions for youth employment issues. Today, young people are being discriminated against in the labour market. They are finding themselves in a position in which they do not have access to social protection in most countries, including OECD countries. They do not have access to the same rights as others, and worse, they do not have access to the same employment contracts as older workers. In France, for example, the first job is generally temporary and short-term, whereas for equivalent jobs, the majority of the population is hired with permanent contracts. And so we really experience this as an injustice, not just an injustice, but actual discrimination. And workers' organisations need to look into how youth are being treated at work. What can we do so that young people have the same level of social protection as others, despite the fact that they did not contribute to the social security system? What can be done so that young people have the same employment contracts as the rest of society? We cannot accept anymore to have internships that are exactly the same as other paid jobs, with the only difference being that they are paid less respected, and with fewer access to rights. This is one of today's main challenges for youth employment, and it needs to be taken into consideration by the trade unions. I would like to end by stressing that these changes will not happen automatically. They will not happen by themselves because young people, especially apprentices, are generally not unionised. People tend to join unions when they already have a job, when they are already more or less in stable employment. Therefore, there is an entire segment of the population, millions of people, who are really not represented today. Unions want to represent them, but we will need to find a way to speak for all those without a voice who suffer daily from a lack of security in the labour market, not because they are not as good as others, they are more qualified, they are full of ideas, they carry the energy of the youth, but simply because they are young, and they are being discriminated against solely for that reason. So this is the issue I thought important to raise and on which I would like to hear the panel's views. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to Emmanuel in France for that contribution. And Josh, I'd like to ask you in Australia, do you agree with him that young people are actually being discriminated against in the employment market?
I think it's absolutely true. I mean, even in Australia, we have a system of youth wages whereby just someone is young. I mean, even those aged 18 to 21, despite being adults for all other purposes, are still considered young people, when as a result are paid a lower rate of pay. There are many sections within the employment system that discriminate against young people, and it's disheartening for those people to think, well, why should I enter the labour market or participate fully if I'm going to be discriminated against for doing so?
Matthieu, to take a regional perspective, do you think what Emmanuel and Josh are saying is correct?
Yes, absolutely. And it is just the nature of things. People come on the labor market to do a job for which they would be less paid because they have less experience, but that they would be able in many cases to perform it just as equally as somebody with a little bit more experience or simply with a different age. And so what Emmanuel is pointing at is absolutely essential, and it's the fact that for the same job, you should have the same rights, and that systematically you don't have the same rights because you come in on the labor market through different means. And this comes to the issue of, for example, internship programs or apprenticeship programs. We keep saying, and it's absolutely essential, that the young people need to be exposed to the world of work at an early age, because this is what they are critically missing. It is that exposure to the world of work. And they do it through apprenticeship programs, which is an excellent way. But at the same time, the rights at work, as they are enforced on the labor market, are not enforced in the same ways for those people who come in through apprenticeship programs. And there's a lot of work to be done at that level as well.
Christine, what are unions in this region? What can they do? And in fact, what are they doing about these issues such as internships, short-term contracts and so forth?
I think both Emmanuel and Josh, what they said, I think this takes us back to what we said a few minutes earlier, that labor laws in a country covers all workers equally, whether you're a young worker or whether you're an older worker or whether you're a worker who's worked for 15 years. So this is what we should do, the campaign, that awareness programs, that the minute you're in the enterprise or at the workforce, there is no separate law for young workers and no separate law for older workers. So if they're being discriminated, it's really because the young workers do not know their rights, that they have to be treated on equal power with the other workers at the workplace.
I'm interested that you've raised the topic of employers being frightened of unions and having a negative attitude towards them, because you could turn it completely the other way and look at what they have in common. Young people want interesting work. They want solid work. Employers need new talent, particularly now when the global economy is rather unstable. Isn't the way that unions can actually work to bring these together?
Sure. I think this is where social dialogue is very important. And this is where we need to bring all the three partners, like Matthieu was saying, whether you're looking at employment policies, you bring all the three partners to the table to discuss employment policies, to discuss what will be the role of interns, to discuss what will be the role of apprentices, to discuss how they will be treated. Because since we are not there discussing this jointly, we are pulling in different directions.
And it's also a little bit of a chicken and the egg situation where, because you have less of this union density for young people, they are therefore less represented in the unions. And consequently, the unions, if they're 75% or 80% of their members are not young, then they will tend to carry the voice of the youth in even a lesser way. And the youth will contribute to say that they are not being represented in the way that they should be, and that is the reason why they don't join the unions. So I think that there is a great marketing effort that needs also to be done on the behalf of the unions.
I think I would really like to come in at this point, which Matthieu has said rightly. If you see several today in the region, the industrial federations have youth committees, have youth structures. They're looking at compulsory 2% representation of youth in the executive boards. They're setting aside funds for youth committees to function. They're even looking at youth discussing HIV/AIDS, or youth discussing gender, or youth discussing migration. So there are different areas where the unions have brought the youth in. And I think sooner or later, once they are on the executive, and they also have campaigns where youth organize youth. So there are different strategies, different structures being thought about now, and how the youth should have not only a voice at the workplace, but the youth should also have a voice in the decision making in the unions.
Josh, I'd like to ask your opinion on this as well. Emmanuel, your counterpart in France, raised the issue of young people's voices being heard in the formulation of strategy. Would you say that is handled adequately in Australia particularly? Christine mentioned a number of devices such as minimum representation and so forth. Are these the kind of things that you find useful?
We do. I mean, in some ways, it's a bit of a patchwork quilt. Different unions deal with these things differently. The union that I come from in South Australia, 65% of our members are under the age of 26. So we organise young workers incredibly well, and we do that by using a whole range of strategies. And if I can go back to what Christine said as well, where it's really important to have a dialogue with employers and to work towards similar goals. That's one of the ways that we've made sure that we're within workplaces where young people are working. I think that we have extended a lot of goodwill to young workers. We have what's called the Young Workers Legal Service, which is a free service that's provided within South Australia that says to people in non-unionised workforces, if you have a problem, you can access this service as a one-only service run by trade unions to provide young people with some free assistance, and so that next time they will join their union to ensure that things go more smoothly. Unions also need to focus on ensuring that they have a youth policy, that they engage young workers within each workplace, so they have young worksite delegates, that we also have youth committees. My union has a national youth committee, and I'm also a representative on the national APYou youth committee, which I chair. So it's about ensuring that right up to the top of all union leadership, there is the ability for young people to voice their opinions, not only about what we can be doing to better represent young workers and make sure that young worker issues are being recognised, but that also we can better engage with young workers right across the community.
That's very interesting. Josh, one of the other things I want to ask you, because we can't leave this discussion without talking about the current economic situation, which everywhere in the world has affected young people more than almost any other group. Do you feel, because young people are quite well integrated into the union structures in Australia, do you feel that your opinions have been taken enough into account in the formulation of crisis response policies?
I think when we look at crisis response and sort of the economy, there's been some engagement. We've done lots of things at the young worker level to ensure that when our Congress meets, that young worker issues are front and centre by holding youth-specific congresses that discuss youth employment matters. And it really comes down to making sure that there is constant engagement between the young leadership and the senior leadership, not just within the union movement, but within society.
Christine, one of the points, I wanted to pick this point up with you about the economic stimulus packages, because many of them focus on public works and infrastructure and entrepreneurship programs, particularly targeting young people, encouraging young people to get involved in these. Now, from a union perspective, do you think this is correct?
From the public partnership programs, like if you see there are several programs created where they can bring in youth employment in large numbers. For example, as we have in India, which is the NREGA program, which brings in a huge number of young people on this public infrastructure programs. And here, yes, it creates employment, but of course we have to see from the ILO perspective, is this employment decent employment? And for us, it's important as trade unions to see that when we're talking about promoting such labor-intensive projects in some countries, whether it really falls under our decent work agenda, which has issues of occupation safety and health, women's issues, rights at the workplace, discrimination, etc.
Matthieu, you clearly agree.
I absolutely agree, and this is where we should be very careful when we talk about numbers and figures, not to forget that having in any given country, let's say a 20% youth unemployment rate, does not really compare to a 50% unemployment rate in a country like, for example, Spain, because there are differences in terms of access to social protection, there are differences in terms of decent work, basically, occupational safety and health, and the whole range. So we have to be careful that in every public policy or public investment type of program, like in India with the NREGA and with some others, that there is a focus that it clearly is on the quality of the jobs, that is clearly on the fact that not only jobs but decent jobs should be created. And the same goes with other instruments that are essential to solving that youth employment problem. I'm thinking of entrepreneurship, for example. It's an absolutely essential tool at the condition that entrepreneurship clearly focuses from the very beginning on the creation of jobs that are decent for the young people.
You have just come back from the 101st International Labour Conference in Geneva, where youth employment was very high on the agenda. What were the participants saying there about the economic stimulus packages and how relevant they were to them?
Well, clearly there was this call once again that was made for the public investment task program, for income security program, for entrepreneurship, for as long as it is linking to decent work, and also a call for enterprise employment creation program. So the workers and the employers at this International Labour Conference 101 did not disagree on the range of those, for as long as there is clearly always the focus on good quality, decent jobs. The fact that having a job is better than none is an idea of the past, and it is clearly been, I think, agreed by both sides that this was not the way to go. We need jobs that are of a decent quality.
Matthieu, thank you very much. Alan, that's all we've got time for this programme. So I'd like to thank all of you who submitted questions and comments, and I'm sorry we didn't have time to use them all. But please keep them coming. We will have future shows. And thank you very much to our guests. Josh Peake from the Distributive and Allied Employers Association in Australia, Christine Nathan, the ILO's Workers' Organisation Specialist for Asia Pacific, and Matthieu Cognac, the ILO's Youth Employment Specialist in this region. And once again, if you have any ideas for subjects you'd like to hear discussed, please drop us a line. You can reach us at www.apyouthnet.ilo.org. Meanwhile, thank you all very much, and I hope you can join us again next time.
This has been an APYouthNet production.